They said she looked less like a bride, and more like something that had crawled out of a grave when she stepped off the train in Silver Creek. It was Christmas Eve, 1884, and the cold had teeth. The wind cut through coats and pride alike, and the snow on the platform had frozen as hard as stone. The town had gathered to see beauty arrive in silk and lace. What they got instead was a thin girl wrapped in burlap and shame. The locomotive hissed and groaned as it came to a stop, steam rising into the purple sky. The sign above the station read, Silver Creek, Colorado. It was a hard town built by harder men, miners, gamblers, drifters, and those hiding from something worse. They had heard that Silas Thorne, the wild mountain man from Blackwood Ridge, had ordered himself a bride from back east. People expected velvet dresses and city manners, and the conductor stepped down first. He looked tired. He set a small, cracked trunk onto the snow. Mayor Josiah Pembroke stood near the front, wrapped in a thick beaver coat, while the rest of the town shivered. He rubbed his hands together and called out, asking where the lady was. Then the conductor reached back into the train and helped someone down. A hush fell over the crowd, but it was not the kind filled with admiration. It was cruel. The girl who stepped onto the platform looked like she had already lost a war. Her dress had been patched so many times no one could tell what the original color had been. A gray wool shawl hung around her shoulders. On her feet were oversized men's boots stuffed with newspaper. She was shaking so hard, her teeth rattled. Her name was Ara Vance. She was 22, though hunger had made her look younger. She clutched a small prayer book to her chest, like it was the last thing keeping her upright. She had traveled from the slums of Chicago, running from debts she never made, and a stepfather who treated her like property. The marriage agency had promised safety. They had not promised kindness. A miner laughed from the back of the crowd. He said she looked more like a scarecrow than a bride. Laughter spread. It rolled over her like stones. Ara felt the heat of shame burn her face, even in the bitter cold. The train behind her began to hiss again, ready to leave. She turned slightly, fear rising in her throat. If they sent her back, she had nowhere to go. Mayor Pembroke stepped forward, eyes full of disgust. He told her there must have been a mistake. He said Silas Thorne had ordered a wife, not a beggar. He told her to get back on the train before she froze to death. The conductor avoided her eyes. The whistle blew. Then the doors of the Nugget Saloon across the street burst open. The laughter died so fast it felt like the air had been stolen. Even the wind seemed to quiet. Silas Thorne stepped onto the boardwalk. He was a large man, taller than anyone else in town. His coat was made of wolf pelts. Snow clung to his dark beard. A pale scar ran from his temple down to his jaw. Some said it came from a bear. Others said from a knife. No one had ever asked him. He carried a Winchester rifle like it weighed nothing. He walked down into the snow without hurry. The crowd parted for him. Boots crunched. His shadow fell over Ara, blocking the wind. He did not look at her boots first. But he did not look at the patches on her dress. He looked at her eyes. They were wide and afraid, yes, but they were steady. She was not begging. She was not crying. She was standing there alone against an entire town. Mayor Pembroke cleared his throat and tried to laugh. He said the agency must have cheated Silas. He offered to send the girl back on the next train. Silas turned his head slowly and asked if the mayor had been spoken to. The mayor swallowed and stepped back. Silas looked at Ara again. He asked her if she knew how to work. Her voice trembled, but did not break. She said yes. He asked if she feared the cold. She said she had been cold her whole life. For a moment, something shifted in his eyes. He held out his hand. It was rough and large. Ara hesitated only a second before placing her small, frozen hand in his. Yet warmth flooded through her fingers. Silas told the station master to grab her trunk. He said she was coming with him. A woman in the crowd protested. She said the girl was dressed in rags and it was Christmas Eve. Silas looked over his shoulder and said rags could be washed. Rotten souls could not. He lifted Ara onto his wagon and wrapped a heavy buffalo robe around her shoulders. Snow began to fall harder as he snapped the reins. They headed toward the mountain, while the town stared in silence. The climb up Blackwood Ridge was narrow and dangerous. On one side was a steep drop into darkness. On the other was frozen rock. The wind howled through the trees. Ara held tight to the robe and stole glances at the man beside her. He did not speak. He drove with steady hands and sharp eyes. After a long while, she asked if he planned to send her back. He said the train was gone and the pass would be closed by morning. If she left, it would not be until spring. She asked if that made her a prisoner. He stopped the horses and looked at her fully for the first time. He told her that down in town she would not last a week alone. Up here it would be hard and lonely, but she would eat and stay warm. In spring, if she wished to leave, he would pay her fare. Until then, she would keep his house, and he would keep her safe. Ara looked at the dark forest and the scar on his face. No man had ever offered her safety without asking for something cruel in return. She said it was a deal. They reached the cabin after nightfall. It was larger than she expected. Strong logs, a tall stone chimney, smoke rising warm into the night. But inside the air was thick with heat from the fireplace. The floors were smooth pine. Rugs made from bear skin covered the ground. The place smelled of wood smoke and leather. It was not gentle, but it was solid. In one corner stood a small pine tree in a pot. It had only a simple ribbon tied near the top. That single ribbon looked almost shy in the large, rough room. Silas carried her trunk upstairs. He told her the first door on the left was hers. There was a lock on the inside, and she could use it if she wished. He said he would sleep downstairs, near the fire. She stared at him, unsure. He moved into the kitchen and began to prepare stew. She offered to cook, but he told her to sit. Tonight she would eat. Tomorrow she would work. When he placed the bowl before her, steam rose rich and warm. She ate too fast and burned her tongue, while he watched quietly, not mocking her hunger. Later he asked her name. The agency had called her only a number. She told him Ara Vance. He nodded and said Merry Christmas. Upstairs, she found clean quilts on the bed. The room was cold but safe. She closed the door and looked at the lock. She thought of the town's laughter. She thought of Silas standing between her and the wind. She left the lock open. Downstairs, Silas did not sleep. He cleaned his rifle by the fire. He knew Mayor Pembroke's eyes too well. The mayor wanted the land on Blackwood Ridge, especially the north face, where silver ran thick through the rock. Bringing a wife into the picture gave the mayor a weakness to target. Silas looked toward the ceiling where he could hear faint footsteps settling above him. He muttered that he hoped the girl was tough, just because the wolves in town were worse than the ones in the woods. Christmas morning did not arrive with bells or laughter. It came with a hard crack of frozen wood and a sky the color of steel. The cold had deepened in the night, sealing Blackwood Ridge in ice. The world outside the cabin looked white and endless, like God had wiped it clean. Ara woke before sunrise. Hunger and fear had trained her body to rise early. For a moment she lay still beneath the quilts, listening. No shouting, no boots outside her door, only the faint pop of cooling wood in the walls. She pushed herself up and gasped when her bare feet touched the floor. The cold bit deep. She dressed quickly in her patched dress and wrapped her shawl tight. When she opened her door, the hallway was silent. Downstairs, the fire had burned to embers. Silas was gone. His cot was folded neat. His rifle was missing from the rack. Ara knelt by the fireplace and blew gently on the coals until a small flame caught. She fed it kindling, hands shaking but steady. Soon, warmth began to spread again. In the growing light, she looked around the cabin. It was strong. Yes, but it was lonely. Dust lay thick on shelves. The kitchen was cluttered with greasy pans and flour spilled across the counter. Windows were streaked, blurring the view of the mountains. Yes, Silas Thorne knew how to survive. He did not know how to live. Ara rolled up her sleeves. She cracked the thin layer of ice over the water bucket and set it to heat. She found soap and a rough rag. Then she went to war with the dirt. She scrubbed the floors on her knees until her fingers turned red. She washed pans until they shone black and clean. She organized sacks of beans and coffee into neat rows. She was not trying to impress him. She was trying to earn her place. In her world, if you did not work, you did not deserve warmth. By the time the sun broke over the ridge, bright and cold, the cabin looked different. The pine floors glowed honey gold. The air smelled of soap and smoke instead of old grease. The door opened. Silas stepped inside carrying 2 rabbits. Snow clung to his beard. He stopped just inside the doorway, and his eyes moved slowly around the room. The clean table, the shining pans, the clear windows. Then they landed on Ara standing near the stove, hands folded tight in front of her. "Coffee is ready," she said softly. He hung the rabbits on a hook and walked further in, almost cautious, as if afraid to disturb the order. "I didn't ask you to do this," he said. "You gave me a bed," she answered. "I pay my debts." He studied her for a long moment. There was no pride in her voice, only truth. He took the mug she offered and drank. Steam rose between them. "You got grit," he said finally. "Most city women would be crying by now." "My mother is dead," Ara replied. "Crying does not heat a house." Something flickered in his hazel eyes. Respect. Before he could speak again, the sound of barking dogs echoed up from the valley. Silas stiffened. He set the mug down and grabbed his rifle in one smooth motion. He moved to the window, peering through the glass Ara had just cleaned. "Who is it?" she whispered. "Sheriff Grady," Silas muttered. "And he brought company." Ara felt her stomach drop. "Stay inside," Silas said firmly. "Do not step out unless I call you." He opened the door and stepped onto the porch, shutting it behind him. Ara hurried to the window, but kept hidden behind the curtain. 3 riders were climbing the trail. At the front rode Sheriff Grady, a broad man with a tin star pinned to his coat. Behind him were 2 deputies with shotguns across their laps. They stopped several yards from the porch. "Morning, Silas," Grady called out. "Merry Christmas." Silas rested the rifle casually in his arm. "You look cold, Sheriff. Why, what brings you up here?" Grady shifted in his saddle. "It's the girl. Mayor says she looked unwell. If she's here against her will, that's trouble. If she's just a drifter, that's vagrancy. Either way, we need to bring her down." Silas let out a short laugh. "Concerned about her safety, is he?" "I'm upholding the law," Grady said. "Bring her out." Inside the cabin, Ara's heart pounded. She knew what town law meant for a woman alone. Silas's voice hardened. "She's my betrothed." "Betrothed ain't married," one deputy sneered. "Single woman with no means of support belongs under territorial protection." Silas's grip tightened on the rifle. "She has means. She has me." Grady sighed. Silas, I got a warrant. If she's not your lawful wife by sundown tomorrow, I'll come back with more men. The door behind Silas creaked open. Ara stepped onto the porch. The cold struck her face, but she stood tall. The buffalo robe hung around her shoulders like armor. I am not a vagrant, she said clearly, and I am not leaving. The sheriff looked surprised. Miss, you don't know what kind of man he is. I know he fed me, she answered, which is more than your mayor did. Silence fell. Grady studied her for a long moment. You have until tomorrow, he said at last. Bring me a marriage paper, or I take you down myself. The riders turned and headed back down the ridge. Silas watched until they disappeared. Then he turned to Ara. Pack what you need, he said. We ride. The journey across the ridge was worse than the climb from town. Snow reached up to the horses' knees. Wind sliced through clothing. Ara rode behind Silas on his black stallion. The arms wrapped around his waist for warmth. Why are you doing this? She shouted over the wind. You could let them take me. Silas kept his eyes ahead. Pembroke wants this land. There's silver under my cabin enough to buy that town 3 times over. If he proves I'm unfit, he takes it. Marrying you stops him. It was business. Survival. But Ara held tighter anyway. They reached Preacher John's cave by late afternoon. The preacher was a thin, wild man, with a beard to his chest and eyes like burning coals. But he had a Bible and legal standing. The ceremony was quick. Snow swirled at the mouth of the cave. Silas stood tall beside her. Do you take this woman? The preacher asked. Silas looked down at Ara. Her lips were blue from cold, but her eyes did not waver. I do. And do you take this man? Ara looked at the scar on his face, at the hands that had offered warmth instead of harm. I do. The preacher declared them husband and wife and demanded $5. Silas paid. They rode back as the sun bled orange across the snow. Inside the cabin, something felt different. Not just shelter now. Home. Silas reached into a drawer and brought out a small wooden box. Inside lay a twisted silver ring with a rough turquoise stone. My mother's, he said gruffly. She told me to give it to the woman who could tame me. Ara slipped it on. It was loose but beautiful. Thank you, she whispered. Before either could say more, a gunshot exploded through the front window. Glass shattered. The oil lamp burst into flames. Get down! Silas roared, tackling her to the floor. Another shot splintered the doorframe. Smoke filled the room. They didn't wait, Silas growled. These aren't the sheriff's men. He shoved a rifle into her hands. Do you know how to shoot? No. Point and pull. Do not close your eyes. Boots thudded on the porch. The door handle rattled. Ara's arms trembled, but she rested the barrel against the back of the sofa like he had shown her. The door burst open. A large man stepped inside with a torch. Ara squeezed the trigger. The rifle kicked hard into her shoulder. The man screamed and fell backward into the snow. Outside, shouting erupted. Flames began to spread along the floor where the torch had fallen. Ara stomped at it with her boots, heart pounding. Then a bottle flew through the back window and shattered, spraying burning liquid across the curtains. And the cabin was turning into an oven. Silas cursed. They're trying to burn us out. Smoke thickened, choking her lungs. We have to move, he said urgently. I'll flank them. You hold the door. He pressed a quick, rough kiss to her forehead and slipped out the back. Ara was alone. The fire crawled up the walls. Wood popped and cracked. She could hear men circling outside. She remembered the cellar. Crawling low through smoke, she reached the pantry and pulled open the trap door. Cool, damp air rose up to meet her. She dropped down into darkness and felt her way along the narrow drainage tunnel. 5 minutes later, She crawled out near the frozen creek below the cabin. Above her, flames roared. Gunfire cracked near the stable. She saw flashes of light in the dark. Silas was pinned down behind a water trough. 3 men were moving toward him. Ara looked around wildly. Then she saw the mining shed. She ran. Inside, she found tools and a crate marked for blasting powder. Dynamite. Her hands shook, but she grabbed one stick and a box of matches. She ran uphill, keeping low. When she was close enough, she lit the fuse and threw. The explosion shook the mountain. Snow and dirt flew into the air. The attackers scattered in terror, stunned and bleeding. Silas rose slowly from behind cover. While he looked up at the ridge, there stood Ara, hair wild, face streaked with soot, chest heaving. He climbed toward her and pulled her into his arms. "You crazy woman," he breathed. "You saved me." Behind them, the cabin collapsed inward with a roar of flame. Ara stared at it in horror. "I burned it." Silas looked once at the fire, then back at her. "It was wood," he said quietly. "You are flesh and blood." He turned his gaze toward the distant lights of Silver Creek. "They started this," he said. "Now we finish it." The cabin burned through the night like a funeral pyre on the mountain. From the valley below, the people of Silver Creek saw the flames and whispered that the wild man and his ragged bride were gone. Some felt relief. Some felt guilt. Mayor Josiah Pembroke felt victory. But Silas and Ara were not dead. They had taken shelter inside the old silver mine carved deep into Blackwood Ridge. The entrance was hidden behind a wall of rock and pine. Inside, the air was damp but warmer than the frozen wind outside. Silas lit a lantern, and golden light spilled across the stone walls. Ara stood beside him, soot on her cheeks, smoke in her hair, but her back straight. Silas led her deeper into the mine. The tunnel sloped downward before opening into a wide cavern. He raised the lantern high. The walls glittered. Silver ran through the rock, thick and bright, a vein strong as a river frozen in stone. "This," Silas said quietly, "is why they came." Ara stepped closer to the rock and touched it with careful fingers. Cold, solid, powerful. "They wanted to scare you away," she said. "They wanted me alone," Silas replied. "No, a man alone is easier to break." He looked at her then, really looked at her. "They did not count on you." Ara turned back toward the tunnel entrance. Smoke from the cabin still drifted through the trees outside. "We cannot stay hidden," she said. "If they think we are dead, they will claim the land." Silas nodded slowly. "Then we do not hide." They returned to the surface at dawn. The fire had burned down to black ash and smoking beams. Snow had begun to fall again, covering the ruin like a blanket. Of the attackers, only one remained behind. The man Ara had shot lay half-conscious near the stable, wounded and weak. Silas checked his pulse. "He will live," he said. "Good," Ara answered firmly. "He will speak." They tied the wounded gunman to a sled and hitched the black stallion. As the sun climbed over the mountains, they began the long descent into Silver Creek. The town was waking when they arrived. Mayor Pembroke stood on the steps of the town hall, holding a mug of hot cider. A small crowd had gathered. He was speaking loudly about tragedy and responsibility, saying that the fire on Blackwood Ridge was likely an accident. He spoke of stewardship and protecting the land. Then the crowd parted. Silas walked down the center of the street like a storm in human form. His coat was burned at the edges. His face was streaked with ash. Beside him walked Ara, rifle resting across her arms. Behind them dragged the sled. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Pembroke's mug slipped from his fingers and shattered on the wooden steps. Silas stopped at the bottom of the stairs. He grabbed the wounded gunman and hauled him upright. It then threw him down at the mayor's boots. "Tell them," Silas said. The man's face was pale with fear and cold. He looked at the crowd, then at the mayor. "He paid us," the man croaked. $500 to burn them out. Said no witnesses." Gasps broke out across the street. Sheriff Grady pushed forward through the crowd, eyes sharp. "Is that true, Josiah?" he asked. "It's a lie," the mayor snapped. "The man is delirious." Ara stepped forward. From her pocket, she pulled a folded paper she had taken from the gunman's coat. "He carried this," she said. Sheriff Grady opened it and read. His face hardened. "It is a bank draft," he said loudly, "from the mayor's fund, dated yesterday. Payment for cleanup services on Blackwood Ridge." The crowd turned on Pembroke with anger rising fast. As Sheriff Grady stepped onto the stairs and snapped handcuffs around the mayor's wrists. "Josiah Pembroke," he said firmly, "you are under arrest for attempted murder and conspiracy." The mayor tried to protest, but Silas stood in his path like a stone wall. He did not raise a hand. He did not need to. As the sheriff led Pembroke away, silence hung heavy over the town. Then Silas faced the people. "My wife and I will rebuild," he said, voice strong and steady. "We found silver on that ridge. Real silver. We will need workers. Honest workers. Triple wages for honest hands." The miners stared at one another. Triple wages. A cheer rose slowly, then louder, until it echoed off the buildings and shook snow from the rooftops. That winter had tested them with fire and blood. But spring came. The snow melted into rushing streams. A green returned to the slopes of Blackwood Ridge. Where the cabin had stood, new stone rose from the mountain itself. Silas refused to build with wood again. The new house was made from granite quarried from the ridge, thick walls, heavy roof, windows strong enough to face any storm. But the greatest change was not the house. It was the people. Silas no longer lived as a shadow above the town. He ran the silver mine with discipline and fairness. He paid his men in coin, not promises. He worked beside them when needed. They stopped fearing him. They began respecting him. And Ara changed, too. The girl who had stepped off the train wrapped in burlap was gone. In her place stood a woman steady and sure. She wore simple dresses of wool and cotton, but they fit well. Her cheeks held color now. Her eyes no longer looked hunted. Yet she built a small schoolhouse near the church. She helped bring a doctor to town. She made sure no traveler was ever turned away from the station platform without food and a blanket. Some of the same people who had laughed at her now lowered their eyes when she passed. She did not shame them. She helped them. Christmas Eve came again 1 year later. Snow fell gently over Blackwood Ridge. The new stone house stood strong and bright with lantern light glowing through its windows. For the first time, the gates were open. The entire town had been invited. Miners arrived in clean shirts. Sheriff Grady came with his wife. Even the conductor from that winter train stepped inside, hat in hand. A tall spruce tree stood in the great room, decorated with strings of popcorn and silver stars hammered from the mine's own ore, and the air smelled of roasted meat and pine. Silas moved through the room greeting guests, but his eyes searched for one person. He found Ara standing by a window, watching the snow fall in quiet thought. He walked up behind her and wrapped his arms around her waist. "You are hiding," he murmured. "I am remembering," she replied softly. She looked out at the snow and thought of the day she had stepped off the train alone and shaking. Silas turned her gently to face him. "That girl is gone," he said. You left her behind. Ara smiled faintly. She was afraid. She was strong, he corrected. Strong enough to climb a mountain. He reached into his vest pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. I have something for you, he said. Inside was a ring of white gold set with a clear diamond that caught the firelight and broke it into sparks. You already gave me one, she whispered. This one is for the woman you became, he said. Tears filled her eyes, but instead of taking the ring, she placed his large, scarred hand against her stomach. Silas froze. Under the fabric of her dress was a gentle curve that had not been there before. He looked at her, stunned. A spring baby, she said softly, when the wildflowers return. Silas dropped to his knees without caring who saw. He pressed his forehead gently against her stomach. I will protect you, he said, voice thick with emotion. Both of you. Against wind, against cold, against men like Pembroke. I will stand between you and the dark. Ara rested her hand in his hair. You chose me when I was nothing, she said quietly. You were never nothing, he answered fiercely. You were gold wrapped in rags. Outside, church bells began to ring midnight over Silver Creek. Snow fell softly. The fire burned warm. Laughter filled the stone house. 1 year before, a trembling girl had stepped off a train into a town that mocked her. Now she stood on the mountain as its queen. Silas Thorne had seen her worth when no one else did, and on Blackwood Ridge, beneath the quiet stars of a Colorado Christmas, the wolf and his bride were finally home.